Welcome, my friends, to the On the Blue Line podcast for law enforcement. I'm your host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm happy to be here with you again this week. This is the podcast where we help law enforcement overcome the mental health toll of the profession to become better leaders and protectors on and off the job. On today's 102nd episode of Morning Roll Call, have you ever imagined, have you ever said maybe something really dumb? Right? I'm sure we all have, right? You throw something on and you're like, man, that's the dumbest thing ever. And then somebody calls you out on it. They like, maybe they catch it and they say something to you, or they write it in a tweet, and then you decide to double down on the dumbest thing you ever said. Well, the person I'm going to talk about this week, that's exactly what they did. Morning Roll Call starts now. If you break the law, if you decide to do this, we're going to hold you responsible.
You are the only good thing in someone's worst day. That is a privilege for a police officer.
At the very least, you could honor the sacrifices of police officers and their families.
We have the ability to save the Republic. Well, thank you so much for watching. Let's get a few things here squared away right in the beginning. A few housekeeping items. First of all, be sure to follow us on Twitter or X, most active on there. That's at On The Blue Line and the number 1. Or if you'd prefer, we are also on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Rumble, TikTok, I don't know. On and on it goes. And those are all at On The Blue Line Podcast. If you would, it's a huge plus no matter what platform you're watching us on. Those likes, those ratings, those reviews are huge for us. Subscribe, all the above. So if you're enjoying it, if you would just leave us a rating or review, or be sure to join on whatever platform it is, that just makes a big difference. And then as always, I love your feedback. Thank you for the emails, and you can always email us at feedback@ontheblueline.com, and that's feedback@ontheblueline.com. The other thing I just want to quickly mention is that on Thursdays, we have the interview room, and that's a little bit different of a podcast where I sit down and I talk to a guest from all types of walks of life, but can give us something actionable for the week ahead. And then, of course, today is Morning Roll Call, where you and I sit down and we just discuss something that is hopefully going to matter to you, or something that's come up during the week. So today, what I want to do in today's Morning Roll Call is, I had been on Twitter. I know it's the Wild West in there sometimes, but I had shared this tweet, and it all started from an article. I was just kind of scrolling through there, and it just caught my eye. And I'm like, what? That cannot be what they mean. So then I stopped it, I read, and then I went back to the original article and I read, and it came from Fox News. And here's what the title of the article says. Wisconsin Socialist, former Democratic lawmaker, says cops have neither dignity nor value. Subtitle, Ryan Clancy said the police may be perfectly fine individuals, but their jobs have neither dignity nor value. And I'll be honest with you, I couldn't let that go. I just couldn't. I shared it and I put on there, this is totally disgusting, and I hold to those remarks. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, I'm going to challenge this in a longer form response, because not only is that not true, it's downright, well, it's dangerous in some ways, but that's a different conversation, but it's also literally the opposite of truth. Like, what he is saying is a lie, and it's disgusting, and it is in violation of kind of like a social compact, right? Of just, and again, people have the right to say what they want. Like, I'm a big free speech advocate. I believe in the Bill of Rights. People have the right to say those things we disagree with. So that's not the issue. What bothers me is maybe there hasn't been more of an outcry about this, and that he hasn't literally been silenced by citizens. That, that's different than the government silencing somebody. An overwhelming response to something can sometimes get you to shut up when you say the stupidest things. And so here we are talking about Ryan Clancy. So a Wisconsin Socialist Democrat, former lawmaker, said that police officers have neither dignity nor value in recent Facebook comments. So then, and he's a member of the Democratic Socialist of America, which more on that in a minute. So somebody responds to him and says, all work had dignity and value, and it's kind of pushing back on him a little bit, right? And he adds, not cops, though. And so this user gets on there and says, no value or dignity. I just want to verify that before I pass it along to someone who might enjoy hearing it. And then he doubles down, says entirely correct, that police officers, quote, may be perfectly fine individuals, but their jobs have neither dignity nor value. He goes on accusing this person of trolling him and so forth, but then ends with one more kind of back step, saying that I did not attack individual police officers. Policing as an institution, this is quoting, policing as an institution as a legacy of slave catching and union busting has neither dignity nor value, he continued. It is inherently racist, classist, and cannot be reformed. So, of course, he's espousing a lot of his socialist viewpoints, which we're going to get to here in a minute. The next day, I was also on Twitter because, again, we've been most active on there. Join us at On the Blue Line and the number 1. And I was looking at an article out of Texas, and the sheriff put the following post on there. Courageous act by our deputy Howard. Last night, while on duty, he saw a vehicle driving the wrong way. He saw the headlights coming to him, and all the lanes moving with him in the same direction were full. He made a decision it was going to be him or other drivers. So he positioned the right side of his patrol vehicle to the oncoming vehicle, likely saving lives. The crash occurred in this location here near Houston. Thankfully, Deputy Howard did not sustain serious injury, but was reported to a clinic as a precaution. The driver of the striking vehicle was also transported to the hospital with non-life-threatening injuries and is believed to have been intoxicated, and he has 2 prior convictions of DWI. So when I thought about how I wanted to respond to this complete insanity that this former representative threw out, I started thinking about these different cases. And this one I see here, and then I was like, well, that reminds me a lot of the one that happened here in Central Florida with Tony Shuck, the Florida Highway Patrol Trooper, who's been lauded as a hero. The 26-year-old law enforcement veteran was the last line of defense before the finish line, where thousands of the armed forces Skyway 10K race runners gathered after crossing the bridge. So if you're familiar at all with like the Tampa, St. Petersburg area, you get over there into Pinellas County, and there's this bridge on the south end that goes up over into the bottom part of what is Tampa Bay. And that bridge is the Skyway, and they were doing this 10K race. And this suspect driver was slammed through the detour barricades and was headed in her direction at 100 miles per hour. Shuck stated, if it wasn't for me to get her to stop, then who? And so essentially, much like the one I just read, creates an accident. Of course, there was more injuries for this trooper, but stopped this drunk driver from barreling into this area by the finish line where thousands of people had gathered for running. So if you're keeping track, when we talk about whether or not law enforcement has value, so far we have thousands plus 1. So if you want to go 1,000 plus 1, that's good. So then I was like, well, what if I just do a search, right? What if I just search in general, law enforcement saving lives? So the next one that comes up was from November of 2022, and that was out of Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. And mind you, this was just cursory searches. I wasn't deep diving. I wasn't specifically looking for years. I was just like, well, what are the top stories that I'm going to find? Body camera released by Jacksonville Sheriff's Office shows a police officer who reportedly doesn't know how to swim bravely jumped into the retention pond to save a baby who nearly drowned. And you're watching it here on the screen, and you see her swimming out through. So she gets there, right? And she's yelling, "Where's the baby? Where's the baby?" And they're like in the pond. So she runs out there, her and another person, and they get this baby out of the water. And allegedly, the officer didn't even really know how to swim. They get the baby, they get her back, and as you can see here in the images, they start doing CPR, and they save this baby. She's in the water she being the deputy, for about 30 seconds. You can see it on the body-worn camera. And then she performs CPR on the child till she was relieved. And essentially her actions undoubtedly saved that child's life, according to her superiors. The next video, which I have up here on the screen, watch this heroic police officer's quick thinking save a Golden Corral dinger's life. Sergeant Gerald Leake of the Gwinnett County Police Department was having lunch with a fellow customer when he began choking on his food. The officer, who'd been trained in a variety of medical techniques, rushed to the man's aid and performed the Heimlich maneuver. dislodging the food, allowing him to breathe, and averting another tragedy. That was just recent ones. And then I was like, well, maybe there's articles that have even more. So then what I did is I just did a search and I came across 2016. That was a dark year when it came to some major events that had happened in the country. Some of these you'll be reminded of. But there's a theme as I look at each of these stories. So these are 6 times that cops saved lives in 2016. It's an article that came out on Police One. In February 2016, Missouri Trooper Jim Thuss arrived at the scene of a crash and found a Honda Civic on fire. The driver, Becky Crawford, was badly injured and trapped behind the wheel. Without hesitation, they crawled in, pulled her out. Shortly thereafter, he and an off-duty Johnson County deputy carried Crawford up a hill to safety as the car exploded into a ball of flames. There's no question, according to the husband of the victim who was saved, there's no question in my mind that if he hadn't taken that action, she would not be with us today. He had only seconds to rescue her, and he did. He's a genuine hero. In February of the same year, an assailant entered Excel Industries where over 200 employees were hard at work and opened fire. He killed 3 people, wounded 14, 10 of them critically. Heston Chief of Police, Doug Schrader, rode to the sound of gunfire and immediately engaged the shooter in a gunfight. The assailant died with weapons and ammo pouches still loaded. Schrader saved many lives. I talked about this back in 2019, but this one officer, Brian Stockbrine of Evansham Township, New Jersey, he responded to 3 bad incidents in 10 days. In March of 2016, he arrived at the scene of a woman down on a lawn. He discovered a badly beaten victim of domestic violence without any vital signs, started CPR, and she began breathing on her own. Thanks to his actions, she survived. In another incident, just a few days later, he broke out the window on a car which was on fire, rescued the man inside. 5 days after that, he's performing CPR on a woman and brought another soul back. In June of that year, the assailant who had pledged allegiance to ISIS went to the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. You'll remember that tragic incident, turning the revelers' night of joy into a nightmare. Orlando officers responded quickly, and they began pressing the suspect, which changed it from an active shooter incident to a barricaded hostage takeover. After 2 hours of negotiations, he told a negotiator he was going to strap explosives on 4 of the hostages. This promise inspired the SWAT team to create a breaching hole in the side of the wall and engage the SWAT officers entering the club in a blazing gunfight, and SWAT prevailed and many hostages were rescued. One of the officers came out and said, as terrible as this terrorist attack was, it would have been worse if not for the courageous intervention by members of the Orlando Police Department, which that response is something else. I actually was fortunate to sit in a class with some of the ones that were there and watch their firsthand accounts of it. And I'm hopeful that one of these days I may have some of them on this podcast so we can have that conversation, but just phenomenal. That was the same year as the Dallas tragedy where the suspect intentionally targeted and opened fire on several Dallas police officers, killing 5 officers, wounding 7 and 2 civilians. He was trapped and surrounded, and of course there ended up being some lawsuits and so forth, but that's where Chief David O. Brown made a groundbreaking call and approved the use of a robot to carry explosives to the assailant. Though that detonation of those explosives ended the carnage, and, quote, "We salute Chief Brown, who preserved the lives of his officers by using all means available to stop the deadly threat." Also, in November of that year, an assailant deliberately drove his car into a crowd of students on the campus of Ohio State University. As the vehicle came to a stop, the assailant exited and began slashing everyone in his path until he was stopped by an officer with the Ohio State University who happened to be on scene. No innocents died thanks to that officer's actions. So, I don't know. What do you think? You think that cops have value? Well, I don't really know what Ryan Clancy is defining as value when he uses that term. But article after article after article after article that I came up with shows that cops save all sorts of lives. In fact, I found a few estimates. Now, it's very hard to aggregate this data properly, but there were estimates of thousands per year that law enforcement officers save, right? So, in an article called More Cops, Less Crime, there is a conversation on, well, what about crime reduction, right? So they save lives, obviously, through lives immediately saved, but if you have more cops out there and they reduce crime, what does that do? So they looked at something called elasticity, which is something economists use when they talk about economic variable changes. So an elasticity rate in the range means a 10% increase in the size of a police force should result in a 3 to 7% reduction in crime. They found that an increase of police presence of about 50% leads to a statistically and economically significant decrease in the level of crime on the order of 15% or an elasticity of 0.3%. So they go through here, according to some calculations, this reduction can be as much as 0.33 for aggregate crime and as much as 0.70 for violent crime just by having more officers out there. Another study by johnlocke.org said 10 to 17 officers eliminates one homicide. So in other words, they've done these studies, right? And they're breaking it down. Okay, if we add officers to a department, law enforcement officers, does that literally save a life that ends in homicide? So on average, they saw a 0.1, well, it was about a 0.07 to a 0.1 lower rate of homicide is what you got per officer. So the translation is 10 to 17 officers on average eliminates one homicide in an area. By having more cops out there doing their job, there's a value. There's actually a quantifiable value to what law enforcement officers do out there each and every day. But then I thought, well, this article mentions multiple times that this Wisconsin socialist is exactly that. He's a socialist Democrat. So I thought, well, when you make a statement that a certain profession has no dignity nor value, then you assume logically that you're measuring it against something, right? You have a worldview, you have a certain perspective, and in that worldview or that perspective, you're saying, well, this has more value than that. So since he clearly identifies, per his own statements, as a socialist and ran as a socialist, I thought, well, what would be better than to compare the value of socialism to the value, because it's a numerical, we can measure these things, right? So since we're going to measure these, let's go ahead and measure socialism to what law enforcement does. So we have law enforcement saving thousands of lives per year are saved due to law enforcement in America out there on the streets every day. So what does socialism look like? I mean, when we compare it, right? So the first thing that I want to bring up is I can hear it already because I'm going to use the term socialism and communism interchangeably. And that's when people start losing their mind and be like, no, I'm a democratic socialist. So because you hear these absolutely bizarre things, let's go straight to the source and be very clear on what this means, right? So straight from a Marxism website is a book that is taught in colleges that's called Political Economy, and it breaks down the socialist mode of production, and it's the gradual transition from socialism to communism. So this is their words, not mine, on socialism versus communism or socialism to communism. So that way we understand what these terms mean, right? So quoting, communist society passes through two phases of development. The lower phase, known as socialism, and the higher phase, known as communism. In the first stage, communist society cannot as yet be free from the traditions and traces of capitalism, from whose womb it has emerged. Only the further development of socialism on the basis which it has itself created can lead to the second and higher phase of communist society. Consequently, socialism and communism are two stages of maturity of the new communist form of society. So that seems pretty straightforward, but then, you're like, well, yeah, but this isn't a textbook, right? So a textbook wrote this, so I don't know if I accept it, right? Do I accept it on its premise? So let's see what Karl Marx actually said, right? So in Selected Works from Marx and Engels, Critique of the Gotha Programme, quoting again, in a higher phase of communist society, wrote Marx, after the enslaving subordination of individuals under division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor from a mere means of life has itself become the prime necessity of life, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeoisie right be fully left behind, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, right? We've all heard that quote. But then elaborating, and this is again reading directly from this, elaborating and enriching the Marxist teachings on communism, Lenin formulated the basic principles for the ways of building the communist society. And he stated, quote, this is Lenin in a report at the 7th Congress of the RCP, in commencing socialist transformations, we must clearly have in mind the aim toward which these transformations are, in the long run, directed. Namely, the aim of creating a communist society, not confined merely to the expropriation of the factories and mills and land and means of production, not confined merely to strict accounting and control of production and distribution of products, but advancing further to the realization of the principle from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So make sure we caught that, right? In commencing socialist transformation. So we're moving this from socialism to communism because it is its inevitable course. And then it goes on to say, in the people's democracies of Europe and Asia, the foundations of socialism, the first phase of communist society, are being laid. So there is no question that socialism leads to communism and is communism. It just hasn't been its fully realized form. So now let's see what that does, right? Is there a value there? Does it affect people? So in an article, Death by Socialism, a look at the numbers, Democratic congressman in 1979 actually reported these numbers, which is pretty amazing and shows you how far one party has changed. But according to this magazine from 1979, 143 million lives have been lost due to socialism and communism since 1917. The human cost of communism in the USSR, 1917 to 1959, under Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, was 66,700,000. That of the USSR from 59 to 78 was 3 million minimum. That of China from 49 to 78 was 63,784,000. And all but 2 years under Mao, another 2,923,700 German civilians during the expulsions. The highest per capita deaths was in Cambodia under Pol Pot, 2.5 million. Out of a total population of 7 million were executed by the socialist leader. Chairman Mao exterminated 1,176,000 in his first year. But death by socialism did not let up just because they got rid of their initial enemies, right? 14 million Chinese were eliminated in the first 5 years of Maoism. He was the greatest mass murderer in human history, followed by Joseph Stalin. He gets 40 million to 60 million to his credit. Adolf Hitler only gets 6 million Jews and 5 million other undesirables. So he gets 11 million, but not quite what Mao and Stalin were able to do. Their numbers were much more impressive on the number of people they could kill with their philosophies. And Pol Pot gets 2.5 million. Of course, small country and all, you know. Vladimir Lenin, all socialist, 1,861,000. In fact, Genghis Khan might actually have been able to get third place. However, he's only credited with 40 million, but it's hard to document things from 800 years ago. So I think I've made my point. Let me read one more thing to you. In Venezuela, for example, an 18-year-old experiment with socialism is entering a horrific denouement marked by hyperinflation, hunger, rising infant mortality rates, and increasingly brutal suppression of the opposition. While the Soviet Union is no more and communism has been discredited in most eyes for many years, it is hard now to even grasp the sheer scale of agony imposed by the brutal ideology of collectivism. Mr. Ryan Clancy, if you're going to come out and state that an entire profession has no dignity or value, let's look at value, right? We have an ideology that you espouse that has cost millions of lives. And we have a profession that has saved thousands of lives every year in America. To me, that is pretty stark. But I want to deal with the second thing you said, which was the word dignity. What does the word dignity mean, right? If you look it up in a dictionary, it's that state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect. So let me give you 3 reasons why law enforcement officers are worthy of honor or respect. First would be selflessness, not selfishness, selflessness. It could be they could be doing anything else. They could be doing another job. Law enforcement officers have skill sets from learning to talk with people, learning to do the computers, working in high stress environments. They could be doing something else and probably making more money doing it. And yet they're willing to stay in this profession to help people. It truly is a decision of service. I can't speak to every officer, but the vast majority of them are not in this. Well, you're certainly not in law enforcement to get rich, but they're in this profession because they want to help people. Many times they know that there's a life expectancy of 15 years less than the general population. And yet law enforcement officers are willing to put on their uniform every day to go out there and work because they do it for other people. It's that whole biblical principle of greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. That is the premise on which so many law enforcement operate. That's exactly what article after article that I read you on what law enforcement officers have done to save lives. That is exactly what these stories are telling us. That is exactly the principle here, is that they have skills that could take them somewhere else. They put their lives at risk, and yet they're willing to do it to try to help other people. The second would be service, right? And it's service that they provide in spite of the hatred, in spite of things like defund the police, in spite of people coming out and saying that their entire profession has no dignity nor value. That's completely absurd. And yet they put themselves out there. They're selfless. They put out this service in spite of the hatred they receive. And then lastly is the sacrifice. You know, a lot of people don't know, but law enforcement in general sacrifices a lot, many times just when it comes to schedule. When we talk about, kids' birthdays, when we talk about trying to make holidays, and we go through things on this podcast where we talk about better ways to do it, right? Scheduled the holiday on the day off. If they're younger children, they're not even necessarily going to know what day is Christmas, but you're still celebrating Christmas. It's just not on the 25th or whatever the case may be. But over and over again, law enforcement officers sacrifice in their daily schedules. And then, of course, there is the sacrifice of life, which we've gone over already multiple times and falls under that selflessness as well. The reality is that the value of law enforcement goes without question. Daily, they serve and protect citizens across this country. They save countless lives per year, and they also limit crime in many of these areas that also protects life and property over time. Law enforcement also serves with dignity. Their actions deserve both honor and respect. But even more so, law enforcement, it's a noble profession. What's nobler? What is more noble than those who are willing to risk everything, including and up to their life, to serve others? The reality is that America is at a crossroad, and as these dangerous, disgusting ideologies grow more and more like a cancer in this country, and people come out and say absolutely foolish things like this, which they have the right to say, this is America, and I am a strong free speech advocate, they have the right to say it. But we need to thank the men and women who continue to serve this country, who are out there putting their lives on the line each and every day. Their value, their dignity has never been brighter, and it's never been more necessary. That does it for this week's Morning Roll Call. I'll see you Thursday in the interview room, next Monday in Morning Roll Call. But in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.